Birdhurst Rise is a street in an affluent part of Croydon in Surrey in England. In 1928, one of the residents of the street was 70-year-old Violet Sidney. A divorcee, which was still a reasonably rare thing in those days, she lived in the Victorian villa with her daughter, 40-year-old spinster, Vera, but her other children lived nearby. These were 41-year-old Grace and her husband Edmund Duff, who was 17 years older than his wife, and their 5 children, who lived at South Park Hill Road, and her son Thomas Sidney, who also lived at South Park Hill Road with his American wife Margaret. The family were close-knit, or so it seemed. It was Violet's ex-husband who introduced Grace to Edmund, and the pair had been married, but he worked menial jobs and they were always short of cash. By 1928, he worked as a clerk at a paper manufacturing company, and on Monday 23rd April, he accepted an invitation to go fishing with an old friend in the New Forest. Before he left, he visited the family physician, Dr. Binning, as he was suffering from diarrhea and stomach pains, but nonetheless went on the trip, with Grace waving him off at the local train station. The following day he spent it fishing, but didn't feel well the next day, so gave it a miss. His friend believed it was a bout of malaria, which he'd contracted while on active service. By the 26th, he felt much better, and the pair had lunch. When he returned home later that day, he complained of feeling feverish, so Dr. Robert Elwell was called. At around 7 o'clock, Edmund ate a little supper and drank beer from a screw-top bottle. Then the doctor arrived at 8 o'clock. He examined him and prescribed quinine and aspirin and told him to rest. At around 10 o'clock, as he was heading to his bedroom, Edmund felt sick, so rushed to the bathroom. He spent an uncomfortable night pacing his room, and at breakfast he tried to drink, but couldn't. The doctor was called again, as he still had diarrhea and was vomiting, and when Dr. Binning arrived, he suggested he take some calomel. Edmund's condition worsened throughout the day, and Dr. Elwell was called, but he couldn't fathom out what was causing the vomiting. The doctors now thought he was suffering from ptomaine poisoning, and that he was in danger of losing his life. Grace called the doctors once more, as Edmund couldn't breathe, and he was given digitalis, strychnine, and pituitrin, but nothing helped, and he died at 11 o'clock that night. Grace was so distressed the doctors tried to resuscitate him, but he was gone. Pathologist Dr. Robert Bronte carried out a post-mortem on Edmund and concluded he'd died of chronic myocarditis, with the vomiting bringing on a heart attack. He completely ruled out poisoning. Edmund was buried in Queen's Road Cemetery. Grace, who was so distraught by the loss of her husband, decided to leave South Park Hill and moved her family to 59 Birdhurst Rise. Vera, Grace's sister, had a private income and spent her time playing golf at the local club and bridge with friends. In January 1929, she began to feel tired and listless, then after a few weeks, began vomiting. On the evening of Sunday 10th February, Grace visited Vera. The following day, Vera went for a walk and saw her bridge friends, but when she got home, she felt very unwell. Vera and Mrs. Noakes, the cook, had some soup for supper, as did the family cat, but Violet didn't want it. Soon afterwards, Vera and the cook were sick and spent the night vomiting. In the morning, when Mrs. Noakes entered the kitchen, she saw the cat too had been sick through the night. Vera spent the day in bed and only got up as she knew her sister was coming to visit again that evening. By Wednesday 13th, Vera felt much better and ate some breakfast. She met her aunt, Mrs. Gwendolen Greenwell, who was visiting from Newcastle, and the pair had lunch together. Mrs. Noakes had made some soup, chicken, vegetables, and a pudding. Grace couldn't join them as she had to attend to the children. Vera and Mrs. Greenwell had some soup, although Mrs. Greenwell only had a few spoonfuls, and were duly sick and suffered from severe diarrhoea after the meal. Vera was convinced it was the soup. Mrs. Greenwell returned to London, and Vera ended up in bed once more. Grace called Dr. Elwell, and he arrived at 9 o'clock that evening. He gave Vera a morphine injection and stayed with her until around 2 a.m. Both Dr. Elwell and Dr. Binning spent the next day with her and consulted gastrointestinal specialist Dr. Charles Bolton. He thought Vera was suffering from gastrointestinal flu. She died shortly after midnight on Friday, 15th February 1929. The death certificate cited gastrointestinal disease, and she too was buried in Queen's Road Cemetery. Violet Sidney had now lost 2 people in her family. Distraught at the loss of her daughter, Dr. Elwell visited her every day, prescribing her Metatone and Phylosin tablets. By Tuesday, 5th March, she was improving. That day she had lunch, but felt unwell halfway through her pudding. Grace called round with some shopping and later stated her mother looked deathly white. Violet told her she thought she'd been poisoned, as the Metatone tasted strongly and was gritty. Dr. Binning was called, but before he got there, Violet was vomiting and had diarrhoea. She told the doctor she'd been poisoned. As Grace put her to bed, the doctor noticed grains in the bottle of medicine and took the bottle to the local chemist, who assured the doctor there was only a very small amount of strychnine in it, and it wasn't enough to kill. Tom Sidney visited his mother in the afternoon and seemed to have improved slightly, but at around 4 o'clock she had a relapse and died 3.5 hours later, with Doctors Binning and Elwell present. This time they felt they couldn't issue a death certificate, and the coroner, Dr. Henry Beecher Jackson, ordered a post-mortem, with Dr. Bronte carrying it out. The police were called in, with Detective Inspector Fred Hodges and Detective Inspector Red Morrish of Croydon CID arriving at the house. It was thoroughly searched, with some bottles removed, and the bottle of Metatone being collected from Dr. Binning. Violet was buried next to her daughter. On 19th March, the graves of Violet and Vera were opened and their bodies exhumed, as arsenic had been discovered in the bottle of Metatone. Violet's organs were found to be riddled with arsenic, and Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, the Home Office pathologist, concluded that Vera too had died of arsenic poisoning. They were reburied on 25th March. Attention now turned to Edmund Duff. His body was exhumed on 18th May and was found to be in remarkably good condition, a sign of arsenic poisoning. A second inquest into Edmund's death began on 5th July and overlapped the inquests into Vera and Violet's deaths. Dr. Bronte came in for some criticism over his conclusions on Edmund's death, and the jury returned the verdicts that he'd been murdered by some person or persons unknown. The verdicts on Vera and Violet's deaths came back with the verdicts of acute poisoning by arsenic. Mrs. Noakes was eliminated as a suspect pretty quickly, but suspicion fell on Grace, as she seemed almost excited by the deaths of her mother and sister, and never really showed any sadness at their loss. Miss Kelvey, an elderly lodger with the Duffs, also deponed that she was scared of Grace and told her she was wicked when she was on her deathbed. Grace had apparently laughed as the 76-year-old slipped away. Detective Inspector Hodges, however, believed Tom Sidney was the culprit initially, but then changed his mind when he saw Grace take the stand. He believed she was in love with Dr. Elwell and that she'd poisoned her husband. He went further to say that the murder of Vera would mean that she would get more money and had murdered her mother to get it all. He stated, "There is something cold and sinister about that woman." Even her solicitor, Richard Whittington Egan, believed that she was the poisoner. The case remains unsolved to this day.